750,000 Democrats increase for over 2014, 87,000 increase in Republican turnout. And in Orange County, although my good friend, who I haven't talked to about this yet, won the recall, parity between Democrats and Republicans in Orange County, which is a 6% decrease for Republicans in Orange County, even though they won in those seats. Look, the California Democratic Party and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee struck a partnership up last June, and we have stuck to that for the past many months, and we have worked as a team and as partners, and it has worked out for the most part very well. Every news story for the 2 months leading up to the election had one theme. You all know what that theme was. That Democrats were going to get locked out of every competitive congressional race. Doesn't matter whether we lost it by 2,000 votes, 6,000 votes, 8,000 votes, 10,000 votes, we're in every race. We live to fight again. This is a primary election. Democrats, we know, don't turn out very well in primary elections. We know they'll turn out in the general election. So I'm very hopeful that, in fact, we'll do more than just pick up the Rohrabacher seat. And we live to fight another day in every one of those districts.
Thank you. For Mr. Brolte, we're looking at some historically low voter registration numbers statewide, and it was a theme of our last panel as well. Where are you going to be choosing to focus your efforts to make an impact, and what are your goals for November?
Well, let's start with the last point first. We've had 3 goals. One, we wanted to elect a Republican governor. You can't get into the top 1 unless you get into the top 2. So there was a lot of effort to make sure we could do that. 2, we wanted to hold what we have in the House. California, a couple of factoids. There are more registered voters in California than there are residents in 46 of the other 49 states. And there are 14 Republican congressional seats in California, and there are only 9 states that have a total of more than 14 congressional seats. So 41 states don't have 14 congressional seats at all. So we have 14 Republican seats. We're a target-rich environment. And third, we wanted to eliminate the supermajority in one house or another. We did that on our own. We had some help with the Democrats last year, but we did that through some of our efforts this year. As to voter registration, you know, most of you haven't seen the presentations I've done to our leadership. Voter registration is going to get worse before it gets better. 40% of Republicans in California are 60 years or older. Only 33% of Democrats are 60 years or older. 2 years ago, I asked our demographers to give me the breakdown of the 8 to 17-year-olds, because those 8 to 17-year-olds are the next decade of registrants. 52% of them are Latino. Republicans get on average 16 out of every 100 new Latinos that register. 11% are Asian. We get about 23% of every 100 that register, and not 4% are African American. We get 9 out of every 100 that register. So if you total 52, 11, and 4, I think it turns out to be 67. So I continually work to encourage Republicans, our Republican elected officials primarily, and then candidates who want to run, to talk about issues that appeal to the fastest growing voter groups, and they're out there. There are a number of issues that you don't lose the base on that other voters care about, charter schools being one. Republicans like charter schools. So do African American voters, so do Hispanic voters, so do Asian voters. So I continue to urge our party's elected officials to talk about issues that really reach the fastest growing voter group. No matter how much you want, party chairs don't get to define issues. Issues, when you turn on the news, you see Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump or Kevin McCarthy. You know, you don't see Eric or me, and the world is probably better off because
It's because we're not slugging it out, that's the reason.
Thank you. My next question is for Alma. It seemed that most people assumed that Newsom and Cox would make it to the November ballot, but down ticket from that, we saw some unpredictable outcomes. I'm curious to see what you thought was the biggest surprise from the results from last week.
I think there was a couple of folks before me that talked about the Assembly District down south 76 with the Dem on Dem, but before I go into that, let me just ground myself a little bit into who I represent and why I'm up here. I represent a little over 700,000 workers, a lot of them in low-wage jobs. So I get to sit with what my daughter calls the fancy people up here because I get the privilege and honor of serving workers every day. So I just want to always start a presentation when I'm on a panel just grounding and reminding folks what a labor union is, and our interests are always with trying to advance a workers' agenda. I think one of the surprises was there wasn't a whole lot of Dem on Dems across that was kind of the talk. It was, and I know you started off with a preface of everyone thought it was going to be Cox and Gavin. I think folks that all saw the polling later on in the election cycle got there, but early on when there were 3 Republicans, it was a free-for-all. We weren't sure what was going to happen and where the Democratic vote was going to split. But I think that the big lesson that keeps repeated here, it keeps getting repeated over time and over elections, is that in a primary, Democrats go home and so do Republicans. They don't, you don't see a lot of crossover party, at least not in a primary, and I would argue very little in a general. And sometimes when candidates latch on to strategies that are counting on the other party's votes, it sets you up for some pretty serious disappointments, because even in the Central Valley, where we see a lot of crossover votes, where I happen to call home, even there in a primary, you do not see a lot of crossover votes in those rich counties that we call blue dogs for a reason. And so I think that was one of the lessons that we just keep, at least both folks up here, we keep learning. I think candidates believe their consultants we can attract, if we're moderate enough, we can attract the other side. Reality is in a primary, as we saw with the constitutional offices, I think I think we have a lieutenant governor race with the top 2, and the superintendent of schools. But I think that other than that, it stayed as predicted. The U.S. Senate, that's right.
Paul, question for you. I'm going to switch it up to ballot initiatives. There could be over a dozen measures on our ballot this year in November: the gas tax, housing bond, dividing California into 3 states. How many will we see? How does that affect the races down ticket? And does it actually help or hurt with voter turnout with that many initiatives on there?
First off, what Alma just said, I really want to touch on, and that is, near the end there was this assumption that it was going to be a governor's race with Dem versus Reed, but that was not the assumption for a long period of time. I mean, convention, if you go back and read articles from 2 months before the election, every article was, of course, it's going to be Dem on Dem, Dem on Dem. And it is almost like, the media and many of the people around Sacramento started to kind of forget the basic math in California. And also the principle that Alma laid out, which is something we didn't talk about before this panel, but the idea post this election, I don't think you're going to see people viewing the open primary as an environment to go in and run right down the middle. And the people that show up, and the people that did show up, were primarily people who were, even among the independents, either they're the most partisan progressives or the most conservative partisans. And that just wasn't hospitable to people trying to run down the middle. So I just really appreciate kind of the viewpoint Alma had there, and I want to make sure that we put a little exclamation point on it. In terms of turnout in November, traditionally we see turnout in gubernatorial general elections around 55, 56%. Traditionally we see turnout in these primaries around 34. It seems like this primary is going to be a little higher turnout than average. You would expect the general election to be a little bit higher turnout than average. I want all ballot measures to qualify, and I want hundreds of millions of dollars being spent in all these ballot measures. But I don't think that the ballot measures themselves are going to be the primary motivator. The earlier panel talked about the governor's race and the fact that now we have a Democrat versus a Republican, what that means for the draw and the attraction for voters. I felt like it was a little bit downplayed. I think that the media is going to make the governor's race into a race. This is going to be seen by people who are conservatives around the state. They're going to see Cox as being somebody who's got a chance to be governor. And so I think that's going to be a draw. I think that the nationalization of some of these congressional races and the conversation around what's happening nationally should serve to increase turnout in this cycle, more so in the general than we would have expected in the primary. I felt that before the primary there was a lot of this conflating of this idea of a wave election. And what we generally see is waves happen in generals. And so more so than we saw in the primary, I would expect to see people talking about national issues, people viewing their participation in the election as being more important, and I would expect to see turnout over that traditional 56%, and not as driven by ballot measures as much as the nationalization of the conversation and on the governor's race.
If you guys have questions in the audience, just raise your hand and I can jump in at any point. I'm going to go back to Eric for this one. A little bit off the wall, Mr. Baumann. If you were Gavin Newsom, how would you establish the relationship with people that just spent millions against you? Do you try to build that relationship? Do you keep your Netflix account? What do you do?
If I was Gavin Newsom, I'd be as tall as most of the Baumans. I got it from my mother's side. You know, I will tell you that Gavin didn't waste a day to reach out to his three top competitors and have conversations with them. I think that his campaign and the unity campaign that the Democratic Party is very rapidly in the process of putting together, as we'll see in very short order, is designed to make sure that all Democrats know that we're standing together and we are together, that California is the resistance to the Donald Trump movement, and that this November is going to send a very big signal across the country. I think it is true that Republicans are better voters in general than Democrats are. They're more reliable voters. And why it's not a surprise for me to see them have 34% the electorate. They are schooled better, they're more consistent voters, and it's one good thing I think that Jim has working for him. Democrats, because we rely to a great extent on working people, on young people, it's much harder to get that turnout amped up. But as long as we're talking about building walls, as long as we're talking about taking health care away from people, as long as we're talking about taking away the right for working men and women to organize, Democratic turnout will be up, not down. It was up in the primary significantly, and by the time they're done counting, I think people are going to be surprised just how far up it really is. I even think Paul's going to be surprised. So I look forward to a spirited campaign, but I look forward to a unified Democratic Party, one that is absolutely willing to work with and stand with non-party affiliated voters who share our values and who share the fear of this president's agenda and what it means to California.
Thank you. Mr. Brulte, this one's for you. Our president weighed in on races in the primary. What does a working relationship with Mr. President look like for you in November? And does a Trump visit to California harm or help Republican candidates?
Well, I think with the president did weigh in the primary. He was very interested in making sure there was a Republican in the top two. And Mr. McCarthy was very interested in making sure there was a Republican in the top two. I would expect the president to come to California. What he does when he's here, I'm not sure. We'd love to have him come raise money for us. If you're watching, Mr. Trump, we'd love to come raise money for the California people.
We'd love to have you come too.
Like every president, there are areas where he would be helpful and areas where he would be not so helpful, just like there were areas where Barack Obama was helpful and areas where Barack Obama was not so helpful. It's nothing nothing unusual about that.
Thank you. Next question for Elma. You alluded to this in your earlier answer. There are a couple of Dem versus Dems on the statewide lieutenant governor's race as well as the U.S. Senate race. What do you feel is really at stake here, and how do you think the voters will decide between the two?
I think in the Dem-on-Dem races, the stakes, in my opinion, in terms of advancing issues that matter for workers in California, there's not that many terrible Democrats. There are a few. But I think that for the most part, and when I say terrible Democrats, is those Democrats that don't believe that collective bargaining is a right for working people. That is what I would define a terrible Democrat. But I think the stakes for on the Dem-on-Dem in terms of advancing a policy, when you're such a solid blue state, the differences are very minor. I think that the stakes are much higher when you talk about the ballot measures and issues, and I just got to say that one of the big surprises, I would say, that signals what voters are going to do in the ballot measures in November is that the only ballot measure that failed was the one that required a 2/3 vote for greenhouse emissions. That is a signal of what is to come, I believe. In the November ballot, there's a couple of pretty nasty ballot measures being actually now turned in for signature gathering. I think that is where the stakes are at. I think when you get into the Dem-on-Dem, for us, there's really no big loss. When most Democrats hold the same values across the board. It comes down to personalities, which, at least for a lot of workers, that doesn't help them get a raise or have better health care and a living wage at work. So I think that the stakes are in the governor's race, which is not a Dem-on-Dem. It is. I agree with Paul that I think the governor's race isn't necessarily done. I mean, there is a registration advantage for Democrats. But I think what Eric was talking about is very true. The Republican base always turns out, and if it's cloudy, Democrats stay home. And so I think that is going to still be a fight, and it will be a real race, not only because the media says it, but because when you layer the governor's race with the 7 to 10 out of the 14 congressional districts that are targeted in California, there is going to be some excitement around it. And when we're looking at turnout and you're looking to advance issues that matter to Californians, the voting and making that a social action is critical. And I think that both of those places both of the governor's race as well as the congressional districts together will garner some excitement, where we'll potentially see a little bump in turnout. It's always a guessing game when you're talking about turnout, but I think that those two conversations with voters, as well as the real stakes that are in the ballot measures, I think will create an environment where voters realize that it is a social action and that they've got to be at the ballot box.
Thank you. This is a question for Paul. This one, looking at some of the articles that were written post-primary, there was a few that said that this was the most uninteresting election in a long time. And I found that surprising. Why do you think that some people felt that way? Is that something that's been out there? And that could be an answer. And from your point of view, was it interesting? What was the best lesson for you?
Yeah, it was a crazy, interesting election for sure. I mean, each of the elections we've had that I've been in PDI for have been interesting in their own way. I mean, 2012 election cycle with that first wave of reforms of redistricting and term limits and the open primary. 2014, which was kind of a echo of that, and incredibly low turnout. 2016, I mean, I wish we could all erase that from our memory, but in terms of excitement level, is pretty high. And 2018, we had a lot going on with, first off, this idea of a blue wave. That has been interesting, and also, I think, really kind of misinterpreted. The idea of these, the DCCC coming into these congressional races, and that kind of really, maybe even overhyped idea of two Republicans making the runoff in those races. And then this governor's race. I mean, we're really, every election cycle since 2012, we're working out what the open primary means. And I think that's really interesting, and one thing that's really interesting about this election cycle. There is one thing, though, this is my rant about the blue wave, and that is, nationally, I believe we're going to definitely have a blue wave. But I don't think that we can get caught up in thinking that these congressional districts here in California are going to have the same type of experience as congressional districts around the country, and here's why. Right after Obama got elected in 2008, those first 2009 special elections, Republicans saw huge numbers of turnout and a huge red wave around the country in specials. In 2010, all 49 states except California saw a huge wave. California was the only state that actually picked up one legislative district, and that was here, Dr. Pan. In 2014, again, Republicans made huge gains, and this is how huge the gains were. In 2010 and 2014, Republicans across the country flipped 1,100 legislative, congressional, and governor's office seats in those two election cycles. 1,100. How many of those were in California? None. Not one. In fact, in California, Democrats have made gains. It's been perpetual blue wave in California throughout this whole period of time. And so if I was sitting in Ohio or Nevada or Arizona and I was a Republican sitting in a seat that was previously held by a Democrat, and I could owe my election simply to the fact that there was this anti-Obama fervor and the Tea Party and Obamacare, I would be terrified. Is that what we have in California? Not really. We have these they're like the antibiotic-resistant strain of Republicans, right? These are Republicans that have sustained Democratic wave years. These are Republicans who survived in Orange County, even though Orange County voted for a Democratic president for the first time. There are resources and opportunities and maybe better candidates than before, and more on the ground happening in this election cycle than before, so that puts these districts in play. But we might very well see a big blue national wave, and just like Republicans didn't see this huge gain in California in 10 and 14, we have to accept that we might not see huge gains in California for Democrats in 2018. These are going to be hard fights to win on the ground, and that's the end of my rant.
You know, I hate to disagree with Paul because most of the smart things I say have come out of his mouth before. But in 14, we did flip a few seats. Young Klim flipped.
Well, congressional though. Yeah.
But you mentioned congressional, governor, and legislative, and we picked up 3 or 4.
Are any of those?
Marisucci, Catherine Baker.
316 though?
2 of them.
2 of them, yeah.
2 of them. But that's an interest. The point should be made if you start looking at the 2008 election. The middle went Democrat in 8. The middle went Republican in 10. The middle went Democrat in 12. The middle went Republican, and it keeps flipping back and forth. The middle in this country is very, very mobile.
Great point. Thank
Just
you.
got a new term, the mobile middle. That's
Heard it here
Bootie's claim to fame.
Write that down.
This is a question, open-ended, anyone who wants to answer. We've talked a few times now in a couple different answers that the gubernatorial race is not a slam dunk. It's a competitive race. Over $25 million was spent in support of gubernatorial candidates. Over $8 million was spent in opposition. Where do those dollars go? Do we see similar numbers in the November elections? And if so, how are they going to be used?
Well, you know, I just want to say one thing to disagree on this statement. Okay, this is with $2 million outstanding. Democratic candidates have over 3 million votes in the governor's race. Republican candidates have 1.8 million. And that's in a primary election without the accelerated general election turnout that Democrats get. So I'm not so sure it's not a slam dunk. Already, I think Cox is going to put up a fight. I think he's going to motivate Republicans in certain areas. But I think that Gavin Newsom is going to be the next governor of California, and just when you see the end of the primary numbers, that'll be pretty obvious.
Do we see the same figures then on spending?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
So do we see the same figures then on spending? We don't, probably, in your opinion.
You know, here's the problem. Does spending money on TV mean anything anymore? Well, you know, everybody says, no, everybody watches TiVo. The DCCC dumps in a bunch of money against Rocky Chavez. He goes from being the moderate, desk-like Republican in the race to ending up in 5th place. So TV still does make a difference. And with digital advertising, look at the insurance commissioner's race where Ricardo Lara was at 22%, and he ends up virtually in a tie with Boisner. And so what I think it really means is that even though voters look for 8 seconds at their mailers as they go from the mailbox to the trash, they do catch their eyes. And the TV commercials still catch their eyes. And the digital ads still catch their eyes. And the annoying hustle text messages annoy them, but they catch their eyes. So all of these things work, but nothing works better than real people going and knocking on doors and talking to voters. And that, I think, was the secret for both Democrats and Republicans in Orange County. I mean, I spent election day in Orange County. I saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people out walking, both for Republican candidates and certainly for Democratic candidates. And I spent the 4 days leading up to the election doing a complete statewide tour. Stopped in 14 cities. And I must tell you that there were so many people turned out to turn people out that it was an unbelievable showing. I've not quite seen this probably since 2008. So I think all of these things work. And I think we're going to see a much more excited electorate than anybody gives us credit for.
I think we'll see a level of resources spent that is adequate for the general election. You asked a question around like how and where was this money spent. I saw where at least a $23 million IE spent the money, and I, for the life of me, cannot understand how you move $2.5 million 4 days out before an election. How in the hell do you spend $2.5 million in 4 days? I honest to God cannot figure out in a real way. And I think that the reality there is that when you have unlimited resources, you don't have to be strategic. You can just see what works and throw things at the wall. And I think we will see more resources spent on turning out. One of the, I don't know if it was a surprise because we saw the polling, but there was a whole lot of conversation, and the conversation will continue around Latino turnout. And what does Latino turnout mean when you have a gubernatorial candidate who's Latino, and then you have a whole set of constitutional candidates all with Latino surnames. And I think the one big lesson that is from the primary is, despite the hustle tax and all of the robocalls and all of that happens, there is nothing better than a peer-to-peer contact, which is still the one place where organized labor excels at. And they always say imitation is the best form of flattery. When I see the other folks trying to imitate GOTV efforts that labor has perfected over the years, not only with our union members, but in the Latino electorate, in the API electorate, and in the African American electorate, I find it ironic and funny that at the same time that they're copying our tactics, their messaging is so terrible. Like I was a Latino surname, 5 of 5 voters, and I got a GOTV message the weekend before the election, or the weekend right before the Tuesday, talking to me about we need 2 Democrats because that's how we're gonna take back the House. I mean, it was so convoluted. I work in the business, and I was like, this is not motivational at all. And I think that when you have that level of resources, you can just do everything. But I think that you will still see resources spent on GOTV. I think you will see folks spending money to make sure that there is excitement. And I think that the congressional races, I don't disagree with Paul around how difficult it will be but I also think it is the one space that voters understand does have national implications, and with all of the threats around their health care, it's the biggest fear is when you're trying to take something away from somebody. And so I think that there will be resources spent smartly, maybe not necessarily to the tune of what we saw in a primary, but that's just because folks spend it smarter.
May I just add one thing, and I just want to make clear. That was $23 million that didn't even get the candidate into second place. So being strategic and tactical and smart about how you build your campaign, how you run your campaign, and what you do really does make a difference.
There will probably be less money in the general. I mean, the Antonio Zai, which spent, most of it for him, a couple million against Cox, and at least 300,000 for Travis. That'll be gone. What the media will focus on may be gone, but there'll be millions more spent in legislative races that most of you won't see. There'll be millions more spent in some of these congressional districts. I don't think there was a lot in Valadeo. I don't think there was a lot in Denham. I don't think there was a lot in Knight. So there may be as much money. It will just be spent below the radar screen. And because we all, if there's a statewide TV buy, we see it, but most people don't see what's going on in cable in the Antelope Valley or things like that.
And let's not forget that with candidate prices, it's still $2.5 million a week to buy a week of statewide TV.
October, it goes up to about 5 million.
October, it goes up to $5 million.
We have a question.
Yeah, I think that this is the election that liberal California has been waiting for since 2015. And based on the conversation at the prior panel and on this one a little bit, I have a question about the Trump effect. The question earlier was, what is the Trump effect? And the answer was essentially, Republican candidates have to be given the ability to agree to disagree with this administration. And when I think about that, and I think about the stripping of dignity for workers, for women, for gays, for immigrants, for childcare, etc., I think, really? Do Republican voters in California really just need candidates who are going to agree to disagree? Or do they need candidates who have the moral courage to stand up and oppose what this president and his vice president and his leadership are doing?
I think you may have actually framed the issue for this election, because most of the time you hear Democrats talk, they want to talk about Donald Trump. Almost every other sentence is about Donald Trump. And the question is, why is that the case? Democrats have owned California for almost 8 straight years. They've had control of the legislature. Jerry Brown's now in his 7th year and 4th month, maybe? 5th month? So why is it that the Democrat narrative isn't about how great things are in California? They want to talk about Donald Trump. Well, I have a theory on that. We're in the 10th year of economic recovery. And by the way, Jerry Brown's the luckiest governor we've had in modern history. He got elected.
And the smartest.
He got elected in the 2nd year of economic recovery. We're in the 10th year of economic recovery. Arnold Schwarzenegger had to deal with the financial crisis. Gray Davis